Welcome to Macondo. We're so grateful to have you here on a Saturday morning, so early. You could have been in bed, but you chose to be with us, and for that, we're really grateful. My name is Jahira Gitahi, and this morning I'll be having a conversation with Joaquim Arena. Did I say that correctly? He's a Cape Verdean author, the author of Under Our Skin, translated from the Portuguese to English, which is the book that we'll be discussing today, as well as his work in general. Welcome, Joaquim. I'll have you introduce yourself in your own words.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Joaquim Arena. I come from a different Africa. I come from Cape Verde Islands, in front of Senegal, off the coast of Senegal, a former Portuguese colony. In fact, we were the first Portuguese colony in Africa. We got independent 50 years ago, so we're celebrating our 50th anniversary. And I write fiction. My subject is African diaspora. And my book, Under Our Skin, A Journey, is my first book translated into English. And I'm happy to be here in Nairobi in Macondo Festival with you.
Thank you. A round of applause for Joaquim.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll start off with you doing a short reading of your work before we get into the conversation.
I'm going to read just a little short piece. My book is about some characters, African characters, and it is a way I decided to show that Africans were or are in Europe way before the migration started in the middle of 20th century. So we had Africans, we Africans were already in Europe, and many personalities in universities, in generals, in different European armies. They were black people. At the time, blacks were seen in a different way. The road snakes left and right, following the course of the river. Rice fields stretch out of both sides, neat and verdant. I wonder if the view here in any way resembles the tobacco sugarcane plantations of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, where other black general I'd been thinking of grew up. Thomas Alexander David de la Pelletrie was born in 1762, the son of a white French aristocrat and a black concubine. The plantation was a failing business when Thomas Alexander's father decided to return to France and claim his inheritance as the Marquis de la Pelletrie. Unable to afford the passage, the future Marquis came up with a scheme whereby he sold Thomas Alexander to a friend in the French Navy and used the proceeds to pay his fare. Once in France, he collected his family fortune and bought Thomas Alexander back via the right to redemption when his friend sailed the boy to France 6 months later. After spending his first dozen years in a rustic hillside in the Caribbean, living in a castle in Normandy, must have been quite a contrast for Thomas Alexander. But that would have been nothing to the Enlightenment Paris he would come to know after his father sold the chateau and moved them to the Parisian outskirts. In Paris, Thomas Alexander would have encountered men like himself, American blacks, the products of biracial relationships in colonized parts of the Americas. Many such men wore white wigs and whitened their skin with rice powder in accordance with the fashion of Louis XIV's court. As Tom Rice reveals in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, the Black Count, Thomas Alexander's father spent lavishly on his son's education. One of the young man's tutor was Chevalier de Saint-Georges, an American black born in Guadeloupe, who was a renowned classical musician and a champion fencer. But Thomas Alexander's gentleman's lifestyle came to an end when his father remarried and withdrew his son's allowance. Unable to continue his life as a dandy, Thomas Alexander joined the army. As a member of the aristocracy, he was entitled to join as an officer, but perhaps fearing that his legitimacy might be called into question, he joined as a private and took to using his mother's name, Dumas. Private Dumas proved to be a brilliant soldier. He began in the Queen's Dragoons, policing towns to snuff out opposition to the French Revolution before joining the so-called Légion Noire, a unit of 200 black soldiers. There he served as Chevalier de Saint-Georges, second in command, but soon moved up to the ranks of his own right, from brigadier general to division general. This made him commander-in-chief to 10,000 men, most of them Caucasian. As a highly rated general, it was only a matter of time before Dumas crossed the path with Napoleon. The two men clashed over Napoleon's laissez-faire attitude towards abuses committed by French soldiers on civilian populations. Perhaps more significantly, Dumas never showed Napoleon the reverence he expected, and he saw through Napoleon's attempts to undermine him. The two men eventually traveled to Egypt with Dumas as one of Napoleon's main cavalry commanders. The campaign was a disaster, and Napoleon heard about mutinous talk from Dumas and other generals. Dumas set sail back to France on a galleon out of Alexandria, but several days of stormy weather forced the ship to dock in southern Italy. The Kingdom of Naples was a sworn enemy of the French Revolution, and Dumas was promptly taken hostage. He spent 3 years imprisoned in Taranto Castle, isolated, underfed, and abandoned to his fate by Napoleon. If his story sounds at all familiar, it's because Thomas Alexander Dumas' son, Alexander Dumas, used it as inspiration for the Count of Monte Cristo. So this general would be the son of one of the greatest French authors ever. So he was black. He was the son of a slave woman from the colony of Saint-Domingue, actual Haiti.
Thank you. Let's start at that point, because throughout the book, we get to read stories of black people who made their mark in Europe in the early 20th century. Alexander Dumas' father, Pushkin's great-grandfather. You have Ghanaians of note who go back to Africa with different results. Why was it important for you to tell these stories within your book?
Well, as a son of migrants, African migrants in Europe, we get used to see us Africans as coming to Europe looking for jobs, as economic migrants, and we are seen by the Europeans as those who are doing the jobs that nobody wants to do, and they come up with an idea which is wrong, that we've only been in Europe for, let's say, 50 or 60 years ago, but that's not right. And I wanted to show through my book, because I did a lot of research, and because, I'm a journalist, first of all, and through my journalism, through my research, I found so many stories during my career, and that showed that that wasn't true, that the Africans were there since the second half of 20th century. So one day I decided to write a book based on these facts. Well, this is a more complex book. As you know, you read it. So it's a kind of a patchwork. I mixed up so many stories. I write about my own family, our journey to Portugal, and the way as kids we became Portuguese as well, because we all went there. I went to Portugal when I was 5, 6 years old. So half of my family, of my siblings, were born in Cape Verde, and half were born in Europe, in Portugal. So I decided to write this book in order to show that for centuries, Africans were there. Africans were professors in universities, in German states, for instance, or were high-ranked generals in the Tsar army or Napoleon's army. So this is something that shows that they had confidence on Africans. Well, this was way before the starting of colonialism, so imperialism, when these countries, they came to Africa and they divided, as you know, they divided Africa in Berlin Conference in 1880 something. So they decided that blacks have nothing to say about their fate, their future. So we're going there, we're going to divide these regions, and we're going to rule. So because they have no say about it. And but unfortunately, it started with the Portuguese, because I have Portuguese blood. My ancestors, they decided that blacks had no soul. Blacks weren't real humans. So this was, a way to justify their coming to Africa. Well, okay, we have to go there to civilize these people that have no history, have nothing to say. So I decided to write this book, and I decided to collect some stories to show that that wasn't true. Before colonization started, we as Africans, we had empires, we had societies well organized, and we were in Europe as well.
Yeah. You say that prior to the scramble and partition for Africa, they had confidence in Africans, and that's why they were bringing them in to do all these large jobs. But later in the book, you speak about Africans being brought from the continent to teach the Portuguese how to plant rice. And would you say that there's a cognitive dissonance there? Because in the book you say the locals wonder, how can these people who are essentially no more intellectually superior to animals, how can they be the ones who are coming to teach us how the best methods of planting rice, for example?
Well, it started because they found out that blacks were, healthier than the Portuguese as agriculture workers in rice plantations. So, rice takes a lot of water, and the malaria was something they had to face. So the Portuguese workers at the time, they died a lot because of malaria. And once they found out that black people, they could work on the rice fields, and they knew how to, because they were brought from that Guinea region where they had already this agriculture, the rice agriculture for centuries, and they had the expertise on this, and at the same time they were healthier workers. They could work on the fields and not getting sick like the Portuguese. So this was the main reason they were brought to work on these rice fields in Portugal.
You call the book a patchwork. For those who are looking forward to reading it, it would be described, I guess, as a mix between a memoir of your life, a lesson on art history, and also a travelogue, because you're traveling throughout much of the book. But at the center of the book is the death of your stepfather. Like, that's the story that ignites everything, right? Before we get into the art and the traveling and so on. And it's this death that makes you reflect on your journey back, right? What prompted you to take this very complex angle for such a short book? You know, we have all these angles coming together, like you said, like a patchwork, but also like a puzzle piece. What made you choose this angle?
Well, I can say that at the beginning it was very hard for me to find the structure of this book because there were so many subjects I wanted to touch.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to write about myself, my history of my family, and I wanted to touch these stories, as I said, from centuries ago, of black people living in Europe and side by side with other professors or generals, etc. And at the same time, I wanted to talk about these Africans that were brought to Portugal to work on these rice fields. So I had to decide what to do because it's not an easy book, and I decided to walk. I walked for more than 10 hours. I followed a river which goes through two villages in southern Portugal where we still can find these people who are descendants of these slaves I'm talking about. When I found out that these people were there, they looked like me, mixed-race people. They are Portuguese. And I said to myself, oh my God, I still can see the grandchildren of these people were brought from Africa. They're here. It is something you cannot find in Europe, anywhere else. And well, this was about 20 years ago. So I decided to go there to see for myself how these people live, how they deal with their past. Mm-hmm. So I walked because I wanted to walk through. I wanted to follow this river and to cross the rice fields in order to imagine how they worked there 2 or 3 centuries ago. So in order to get inspired to write my book. And I found these people in 2 villages, 2 small villages. They look like Cape Verdeans. Some of them look like Caribbean people. And every time I would ask them about their past, they would deny. They would say, no, we have nothing to do with blacks here. Are you crazy? Whoa, what brings you where did you get this idea from? Well, I said to myself, well, I have to be careful because I will start a war or I will be seen as persona non grata by these people. So I went twice there. I went for the first time to see. I went by car, of course. And then I decided to walk. And for the second time, I rented a house there for a week. And I went to the cafes. I went to the bars, the restaurants, small restaurants, local. And I started talking with these people in a way that they could tell me something about their ancestors. Some of them, they said to me, oh yes, we know that we have a little black bald on us, but what can we do? And others wouldn't recognize this. So I decided to write about this physical journey and at the same time another journey through history. And to talk about these blacks, as I told you, these black people brought to Europe. So that's how I found out my structure, the way I could write about all these subjects. A physical journey and a historical memory journey.
Speaking more about this denial of blackness that you reference, in the book you say, rather philosophically, being mixed race involves a denial of one's negritude. Can you speak to us of one's negritude, of one's blackness?
Oh, yes. Well, this has a lot to do with my country. I have to start explaining you that as the first Portuguese colony, Cape Verde, we have 10 islands. When the Portuguese arrived in late 15th century, there was nothing there, just birds and some bushes, no people there. We were not inhabited country. So they brought people from Senegal, from Guinea, enslaved people. Was it the first place, how do you say it, outpost, where you would bring slaves in order to sell them to the Americas. So this is the first, I can say that my country is the first diaspora destiny. So the first place where Africans from West Africa, when they were taken from their countries, from their regions, they were first taken to my islands. So it was the first spot. And then from there they went to Brazil and to the Caribbean. We came up with the Creole, the language, because when you have Africans and the masters, the Europeans, in a place during some time, whether you start learning the master's language, like they did in Brazil and the United States, they don't have a Creole. They learned English. But in our islands, I don't know, somehow we decided not to learn the Portuguese from the Portuguese language. So we decided, we don't know, we never know how a Creole language starts. So we came up with this Creole language. But at the same time, we were educated because we became mulattoes and mestizos like me. And so the whites, the Portuguese, would see us a little different. And they would teach us, especially the Catholic Church. So through that, we arrived at the early 20th century as a very well-educated people, colonial people. Like the French did the same with the people they brought from Guadeloupe and Martinique to help them run the empire. So we were brought to Africa to help the Portuguese into the colonial administration. So we became kind of associated because we were mixed people. They would tell us, oh, no, you're not black, you're civilized. You cannot compare yourself with a Senegalese or a Guinean. So that became part of our minds, which is wrong, of course. And every time there was a fight or there was something in between the masters and the blacks, of course, the mulatto, the mixed-race person would take the master's side. So this is something I noticed. I found that in my family, the way my family, even my mother, the way she talked about the blacks in the continent, and as different people, and I would tell them, but Mom, we're Africans. Okay, we're Africans. We're not like them, because this was something the Portuguese brought to us, and we were educated as a different people that would help them run the empire. We were sent to Angola, to Mozambique, to Guinea, to help them run the colony. So many Cape Verdeans, they start thinking as kind of a second-rate Portuguese, which is very bad. Being second of something, it's too bad. So it is something we haven't we haven't been able to deal with this in our country, because we still have people that they think they're not Africans, they're Atlantics. They don't want to see themselves mixed up with Africans. And it is something that even 50 years after the independence, we still deal with these traumas of colonialism. It's a good material, a literary material for me.
Yes, the colonial hangover. That's what we call it.
Yes, colonial hangover.
Yeah. You've touched on religion. You said you've spoken about the Catholic Church conducting education, and in the process, indoctrination as well, I would say. And religion is also an element that comes out a lot in your book. When you go to Portugal, you meet a lot of people in the villages who are Catholics, and who, I think that correlation between whiteness also goes with religion, in that they see themselves to be Christians and relying on religion almost as a refuge to run away from their blackness or from their histories. And then also you take us to North America. You speak about really interesting Cape Verdean characters. One of them is called Daddy Grace, and he has a sort of like a mini cult, a little church, a super church, a mega church, I think, even by the end. And even though he doesn't view himself as black, all his congregants, majority of his congregants are black, right? And we know that in North America, religion, evangelicalism is used also by the black people as a crutch, or as an opium of the masses, as Marx would say. Can you speak to us more about like the influence of religion, especially amongst the oppressed people, what you got to witness or to hear about from the stories that you heard from your family about characters like Daddy Grace?
Well, Daddy Grace was a young man who went from one of the islands. The name of the island is Brava. He went to America in late 19th century. Well, I should tell you before that Cape Verdeans were the first black people or mixed people ever to go as free men to America. We went there, we started going there as crew members of whaling ships in late 18th century, early 19th century. So this is how the Cape Verdean migration to the United States began, through sailors. They would then go and find jobs on land, and they would bring their families. So that's how we have 500,000 Cape Verdeans living in the east coast of in New England states, in the United States. So Daddy Grace, his name was Marcelino. It wasn't Daddy Grace at all at the beginning. It was Marcelino, a young migrant who went to the States with his family. So he worked, he did odd jobs, you know, like all migrants. And when he worked in the railways, he would go to southern states, and he would see these preachers. At the time, there were a lot of preachers, you know, black preachers. They would gather lots of people in a tent and would make his speech, and he would see how people reacted. So he said to us, I can do that. And it was an easier way to make a living. So he decides to start a church, a Pentecostal, not a Catholic. And he became rich. He died in 1960. I don't know how many big houses and estates he had, and some millions of followers. Somebody who came from an island, which gave him some sort of a mystery, because he could speak in tongues. And when he would speak in tongues, he would speak our Creole. It's amazing, because some Cape Verdeans would go to his church, and when he would start speaking Creole, people around him, Americans, black Americans, they would, you know, yes. And the Cape Verdeans, they would laugh. This is Creole. This has nothing to do with the secret tongue or whatever. So, the Pentecostal and Protestant churches, they came to Cape Verde through missionaries, through Cape Verdean migrants that came back and brought it. But in Cape Verde, we are very Catholic. I think 90% of the population is Catholic. So, in one hand, they did a good job. They helped people because, you know, we suffer from droughts and for centuries. And Portugal, I can tell you, and you can imagine, small country, small southern European country, at the heights of its power, it was in the 15th century. So when we come to late 19th or early 20th, it's not it's not a powerful country. So it has this empire where it had Brazil and then some colonies in Africa and some in Asia. But the Portuguese people realized they're very poor. They can't afford to have colonies. They even tried to sell the colonies to the Germans before the First World War. So we were kind of abandoned, or I wouldn't say abandoned, but the Portuguese were so weak. Portugal was so weak. Portuguese had to face their own problems in the country, whether to come and to help us. So Catholic Church did what they should have done. The colonial administration was kind of replaced by the church. So they helped people, poor people. They helped to feed the people during the droughts, etc. So we owe a lot to the Catholic Church. Yes.
You've just mentioned that, and I remembered yesterday a story broke out about a school in Kilifi County, which is towards the south of the country, where they're suffering from severe famine and drought. And the Hare Krishna religion is providing them with food, but first they have to say Hare Hare Krishna, you know. So maybe the new colonizer, you know, maybe.
You know, church as always, the Catholic Church has always followed the colonialists, you know, and well, we have to talk about that. They did that part in exploiting the people, you know. Can you imagine bringing hell, sin, and all these dogmas from the Catholic Church to Africa, to people who have lived for thousands of years in a very balanced society, with nature, and all of a sudden you have these priests that come with this health stuff, and how do you deal with that? How do you have to change your whole culture, and because you're not civilized, you're doing wrong things, your culture is wrong, you have to, and even they took all these to Pacific Islands, you know, to Tahiti. No, the ladies, you have to put on some clothes. So this is traumatic. And Catholic Church helped to exploit these people too. They took advantage of these. They did lots of good things, I'm just saying, in my country. They helped other people, but in other countries, they kind of destroyed, they helped to destroy old countries.
Yeah. Just final two questions, because I know we need to move to questions from the audience soon. This is a personal question for me, because I'm very passionate about alcohol consumption trends amongst colonized people. When you're discussing one of the paintings that you viewed, you speak about how there are black people in the foreground or the background who are drunk, and how dangerous it was for them to be drunk, because Africans were not allowed to consume alcohol.
In Lisbon, yes.
Yeah, in Lisbon. They were not allowed to consume alcohol. And so for them to be drunk means that they had to steal the money to buy the alcohol, right? And then, of course, centuries later, we see your stepfather also has an alcoholism problem. Do you see any correlations personally between oppression and alcoholism, both in your country and in Portugal?
Well, it's a big question. Well, let's start from what you said. You said about it was in 15th century. You know, I should say that 10% of Lisbon population at the time were black. This is another reality few people know about. Even in Portugal, they ignore these. 10% of Lisbon population were black people brought from the colonies at the time. And you can see it in some paintings that if we go to some museums, we don't pay attention. Most people don't pay attention about who's behind the main characters of the pictures and the paintings. But we see black people walking on the houses and dealing with horses, playing instruments during some celebrities, ceremonies. So the population, the black population, was so important that the authorities, they tried to get some laws, passed some laws to avoid or to prohibit, black people of consuming alcohol. And black people at the time, they couldn't even have a horse. They weren't allowed to ride like any other person, white person, because that would give them a status, a social status. So all these laws were in order to keep the black population and in their place, in their neighborhood. So alcohol was, alcohol, black people means music. So no matter where you are, even if you're in Moscow, if you're a black people, you feel, you talk, and you have this culture. So it was shocking. It was shocking. And well, where there's a music, there's a party, there's always alcohol. So they decided to have these laws. Blacks couldn't buy alcohol. Well, in my country, we do have a problem because we have sugarcane rum, and but it's a different, quite a different problem. It has to do with social problems, lack of jobs, unemployment, and a lack of future. The idea of what you can do in your life. So if you don't go to Europe, or if you go to the United States, what are you going to do if you stay there? And we produce a lot of rum there. So it's a problem because the young people, they haven't much things to do during weekends, so they consume alcohol. So my stepfather was brought on this. They start drinking alcohol from the teenage years. So it's a problem. It's a big problem in our country.
Here too, don't worry.
Oh.
Misery loves company. Final question, right? In light of all the research that you've done about all these great black people to go to Europe and make a name for themselves and for the continent, what do you make about this big furore that there is now in Europe about immigration, or the immigrants, in the present day?
Wow, that would take us to another session, because I live in Cape Verde, but I live between Cape Verde and Portugal. And now Portugal used to be one of the safe. Well, it's the safe. You can go there, you can walk on the streets at night. You won't have any problems. But we have the second biggest party is a fascist party. Can you imagine that in Portugal? That we're used to see that in Germany or in Austria or in France, etc. But it's something where it's like a dream. It's like a nightmare, actually. Well, it brings us to a different time, because what happens is, all of a sudden, because this is, even in the United States, the Trump thing and fascism in Europe, and they say we were promised, when we say we, I mean society, people, we were promised lots of things from the decades after the Second World War. There was the growth, economic growth was big, everybody was happy. The Cold War then came to an end, and we thought that we have achieved a kind of a balance in society, but that wasn't true. People were left behind, even the socialist promises. Well, let's take a look at France. The socialists, they promised a lot, and but they forgot part of the society. Lots of people, they were left behind. So people were left behind. At the beginning, it was small communities, but then they started to become more and more and more and more. So we come to a moment that most of these people, they can't afford even their homes. And well, you can multiply these for millions in different countries. And at the same time, we have, which I think is the most important item in this big problem, migration. Migration from third world countries, the so-called third world countries, from Syria, from Afghanistan, etc., which the Europeans provoked that because they sold guns to these wars. They supplied guns to these wars, and people are running away from the wars. They have to go to healthier countries, of course, wealthier countries. So what happens is lots of migrants coming, poor Europeans left behind, and the governments, the weak governments in Europe that cannot deal with these problems at the same time. And we have these fascist and right-wing parties that always come out like mushrooms during the crisis. It happened in the 30s when Hitler came to power. It was the same thing in Germany after the aftermath of the First World War. So we're living the same. We have the same causes, I can tell you. We have wars bringing people, migrants that are running away from these wars. Europeans are selling guns to these wars, are making a lot of money. European poor people left behind, and we have these fascist parties. So they look for a scapegoat. Always scapegoats. So in Germany in the 30s were the Jews, now the migrants, and now the black people, and the story repeats itself.
All right. Would you like to read us a little something to wrap up the conversation? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So, can I choose any?
Yeah. Oh gosh. Here we go.
I tried to picture that day in 1444 as the half-dozen caravels, they traveled and approached the promontory. The Africans would first have noticed the two mountains beyond the town, then the hills that led up from the beach. They would have seen the narrow mouth of the Rio Bensefrin that was to welcome them into this terra incognita. The enigmatic sound of a church bells would likely have reached them before any sight of the church did, but they would have seen the towers of the ramparts from some distance away. The town would have come gradually into view, built into the foothills on the left bank of the river, the right bank being one vast beach. Tired and afraid, hungry and thirsty, exhausted from seasickness, most of them never having been in a boat before. They would have watched as their ship entered the river channel. Their arrival would have been greeted with cheers from crowds gathered on the riverbank and from people on barges. Friends and family come to welcome home the ship's crew. The sound of joyous reunions would have them faded away slowly as everyone departed, and the Africans were left to spend the night on the caravels. The next morning, they would have been woken, assuming they slept at all, by the chief of the white men shouting instructions. They would have been hurried off the boats and led into the large field beyond the city limits, today the Rocio da Trinidad, soccer field and campsite. They would no doubt have assumed they were about to be killed by the bearded, metal-clothed white man, and perhaps even eaten by the people who had started to assemble in a circle around them. The locals would have had some experience of Moors, but the only knowledge most of them would have had of jet black people would have come from sailors' yarns told in taverns. Those who went to the field to gawk, some of them traveling from surrounding villages to do so, would have seen the heathens with their heads bowed and their faces streaming with tears, exchanging nervous glances or looking to the skies for help. They would have heard them wailing with despair, pain, and sickness. The chronicler Zurara recorded that some of the Africans struck their own faces with the palms of their hands or pounded the ground with their fists, cursing their misfortune or lamenting their fate in whatever passed for prayer in the customs of their land. The drama of anticipation continued until they began to be divided up, split into 5 separate groups, so that Prince Henry, watching astride his horse on the hillside, could select his share to the royal fifth. The Portuguese officials, led by Lanzarote de Freitas, captain of the enterprise, sought to divide the weak and the strong evenly, meaning mothers would separate it from children, wives from husbands, and so on, family ties in irrelevance. When the Africans realized what was happening, chaos ensued. Children clung to their parents, and mothers ran around madly trying to gather up their offspring, only to be dragged away from them, howling and sobbing. The whole sorry spectacle confused base sentiments of the Christians watching, and even aroused the pity of Zurara, for it was a shock to see evidence of such human emotions in those they'd been told were not human. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Joaquim Arena, everyone. We have about 15 minutes to take questions, so do we have any questions from the audience over here and at the front?
So one of the greatest things that the Catholic Church brought to, well, African countries and also to the Latin American countries was education and schooling. However, this came at the price of our culture and very often our names. A lot of names that we have in Cape Verde, in Mozambique, in Angola, in Brazil, in Colombia, and so on, are names that were given to us by the Catholic priests and so on. So my question is, do you think that this trade-off was worth it, education for culture?
Well, where am I to? There are different experiences. I mean, in Africa, I don't think we can come to a conclusion as a whole, because this is not white, black and white. We have gray in between, you see. It depends on countries. Like in my country, we had no culture destroyed. On the opposite, we are part of something the Portuguese did, or the Catholic Church did. We are like the Caribbean. If you go to the Caribbean, they might have the same idea of themselves, but maybe in some countries in the continent. Well, if you go to Congo, I can start telling you about Congo and Leopold, King Leopold, what they did, and the genocide. We talk about the first African genocide was in Congo. They would call it the Free State of Congo, which was not free. It was a country at the time. It wasn't a country, but it was a region that was it belonged to the king of Belgium. So I can ask you what the church did there to help the Africans, or to help to free the Africans. And if we go to other countries that had, it's hard to talk about a light colonialism or a hard colonialism. We cannot divide. We cannot say that this one was better than the Portuguese colonialism was better than the French or the British. It's hard for me to answer that question. It depends on each of the countries. Some countries had a different relationship with the Catholic Church. I'm not talking about countries like Kenya. I don't know, maybe that's a different reality because of the missions, the Pentecostal churches, different churches. But for what I can, from what I know of the researches I did, the church, the Catholic Church, they went along with the colonialists in most countries where they were. They didn't side up with the how do you say the abolitionists. They did not. So we might find some priests, but as a whole, the Catholic Church stayed by the side of the colonialists.
I think a perfect example of the atrocities of the Catholic Church would be Rwanda, because they were pretty much at the helm of the genocide. But even before the genocide in the Congo, you have the genocide by the Germans in Namibia, of the Herero and the Nama. I mean, how many genocides? There's another question here.
Well, thank you very much for coming to Kenya, and I congratulate you on your writing. If you don't mind, I'll just comment on the question that he's just asked. I do not think you need to be enslaved in order to be educated, and also I do not think today we're any more important than our ancestors who are enslaved. And if you were to ask them, is it fair to trade education for the type of enslavement that you so graphically described, I don't think they would say, we are prepared to pay this price so that in future our children can be educated. There are many countries, whether it's Japan, it's whatever, they're as modern as anywhere, and they were not enslaved in that way. So I don't know it's how it's taught in Kenya, by the way. They teach, the pros and cons of colonialism. That's how the education system teaches us, but I think, honestly, it's two different things that we are talking about, which I think is what you captured. But I want to come to my question, which is, I was very taken by the graphic nature of your writing. Like when you are describing that passage you read, when you are describing the arrival of the black people in Cape Verde, and I wondered, you as a writer, perhaps with ancestors who were enslaved, I don't know that for a fact, what is the process you use to, deal with the trauma of capturing such writing? And then a second question, what is your feeling about reparations? The Portuguese were the original European slavers. Reparations is very much, a big topic that's coming up. In fact, there's a festival coming up next month specifically on that theme. So I just wondered what your insights are.
Thank you. Well, this passage I was describing, it was not in Cape Verde. The arrival of the slaves was in Portugal in 1444. I think it was the first time black slaves or black people were sold as slaves in Europe. As I was saying, this was in Portugal, and it's a milestone, because from there we can say that the trade slaves started as we know it in in the Atlantic and the west coast of Africa. About reparations, well, I'm in a very privileged position because we, as a country that was, I can say, was made by the Portuguese through mixing people, we cannot compare ourselves with Angola, Mozambique, or Guinea-Bissau, because the Portuguese, when they arrived in this country, these Africans, they had already a society, structure, empire, even empires, kings. They were organized. They were living in for ages. Their ancestors lived their lives in a very balanced way, like most places in Africa. There was some societies organized. I mean, the Empire of Mali, and the Europeans, they destroyed and they took some of the some objects. We can talk reparation about the objects they stole. This is one thing. You can bring them back. They have started doing this. The museums in Europe are filled up with these objects that are part of the African culture. They have a meaning inside this culture. I mean, it's quite different than being in a museum in Europe. But when we talk about slavery, the reparation, well, that takes us to another level. Should we talk about money? Because what we have now are examples of. She just mentioned Namibia. Namibia received a lot of money from the Germans in order to say, I'm sorry, or for what we did. And some other countries are trying to find a way to deal with this part of their history. It's not easy, but something must be done. I know, of course, we all know, but how can we repair millions of people who were enslaved and taken across the ocean? This is something, I don't have an answer for that, and I don't think there is an answer. We can talk. It's something that we have to talk about and try to find ways of, we can start by teaching at school the children how it was. We can start by changing history books like they're doing in Portugal right now, because the history books talked about what the conquistadores, what they did. They brought Christianity and civilization to Africa, etc. Now they're changing. They're changing that. This is one step, but it's a huge problem. I think it's something very, I'm not sure how we can deal with that, but we can start by helping these countries. Well, I can tell you, because I'm here as a writer. I was invited, and the Portuguese embassy paid for my ticket. This is something good, because they're helping me. And this book was translated into English in America with the money from the Portuguese Cultural Ministry. So this is what happens with most of African Lusophone writers. We've been translated through the Portuguese cultural centers around the world. This is just a small thing, but this is something that they can do in order to help us, in order to maintain a relationship based on the culture, on language, for instance. But when it comes to slavery, well, this is something. Even the Brazilians, which received most of the black people from Africa through Portuguese, the Portuguese, they haven't come yet to an idea of how they expect to be repaired, And I think Brazil has the biggest black population in South America. So this is I think this is a trauma, but at the same time, we are very careful when we come to repair the slave trade. We can, as I was saying, we can give back all objects that were taken from Africa that are at museums. But when it comes to slavery, it's another thing, it's another level.
But just to throw a spanner in the works, when it comes to financial compensation, I don't know about the Portuguese, but at least in North America and with the British, slave owners, upon the end of slavery, were given financial compensation.
That
right?
was the only way to abolish. They were compensated. And the discussions in the British Parliament wasn't about whether slavery should be abolished or not. It was about how much
Yeah.
they were going to pay, because
And they
slaves
finished paying that debt in 2015.
in Jamaica. Yes, but the Jamaicans, the planters, the white people in Jamaica, they were those who got more from the British government. Because it was a matter of time. They all knew slavery would come to an end. They spent years discussing this issue because of the money that they were about to receive for each slave freed.
Yeah.
Okay, that's.
Well, is there a final question? Just one last question. Yes, over there.
Thank you for the opportunity. So my question is, what is the core message that you'd like readers to take away from the book?
The message of my book? It's up to you, readers, to get the messages, because when I write a book, I think most writers, well, at least I think, when I write a book, I don't think of a message. I have a subject. I want to touch that subject. And in this case, I want to show that the truth is not what we hear now, that migrants are there. In Europe, they've been there for 50 or 60 years. No. It's not true. So because I didn't find this information around in books, etc., nobody cares. Nobody cared about black people in Europe. There were workers, construction workers, etc. And I decided to write the book because nobody did it. So some books, you have to write them because nobody else has already written. So, and if you have the information, you write it. I don't have a message because I touch so different subjects here. But it deals, I can tell you, it deals about the African diaspora. We have to write about African diaspora because it's another story. It's another part of the African world that it's been hardly touched. We can talk about African Americans, you know, writers from the early 20th century until Toni Morrison, etc. We do have writers that did it. But throughout the world, in Europe, it's something very, how to say, recently we came up with this word Afropeans. Afropeans, Africans born in Europe from Africa, Europeans born in Europe from African families. They have these two cultures, Afropeans.
Double consciousness.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being so engaging. A final round of applause for the author, please.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the day. I hope you get to attend more sessions. Thank you so much for coming to this one.